I was just telling Tim here how excited I am about this talk. I love this project. It's a project I always say it's one of the projects that I feel I've been waiting for 10 years, and I just discovered it, and it's amazing. So I'm super excited to hear about its use in the wild in a real case. So Tim, please take it away.
Oh, thanks very much. It's actually a perfect handover to what I was going to say, because what I want to start with is that I think there's a large body of work at the moment from people like Oliver and Cora who've done architectural deep dives on Spring Modulith. My session is more about when we started working with Spring Modulith, there wasn't really people talking about it yet. So it's kind of, in some ways, our blooper reel of, hey, these are the mistakes that we made. Kind of go forth, make your own mistakes. Don't repeat our mistakes. So who am I? I'm Tim. I'm an engineering lead at KLM. The only reason that is relevant in any way, mean, or form is that means I have hierarchical responsibilities, which means that I occasionally get to go walk past a pull request, but for the most part, I leave it to the rest of the engineering team. To provide a bit of context, we are the IT partner to security services within KLM. What they do is secure KLM operations from ground, so our access cards all the way to cybersecurity, and maybe some things in between which are maybe a little bit less obvious. And that's kind of where we're going to dive into in this session, is the work we do for the intelligence team. And in a sentence, what they do is on-ground and in-air security assessments. So what does that mean? So a couple of examples here. Should we even fly? Is the airspace safe? Are we flying over a war zone? Are we flying between two countries that are at war? When we land in a station, is that station safe? Once we're in the station, we need to also look at it and say, can we get our crew to a hotel? Once we're at a hotel, we need to do an assessment and go, are the crew allowed to leave? Are they allowed to leave by themselves? There's a whole chain of operations, and this is just one part of that chain. Something else that happens out there in the world, protests. Protests happen on a daily basis. Singularly, protests aren't of interest. Normally what would happen is we would look at a protest, go, that's not particularly relevant. Obviously, if there is a trend of protests, we look at that and go, maybe we need to do an assessment on where we're flying to, kind of upgrade this. But just to give an example, if there is a protest and we have a specific location, we might flag that one and go, we need to look at this because that's right next to one of our crew hotels. That doesn't automatically mean that we're going to stop people staying at that hotel. We then just need to have an assessment and go, well, what country are we in? What is the stability going on there? Do we think this has a chance of turning violent? We have to do all of this, and we have to assess it and just kind of work out, what is the security assessment? Is it low risk? Is it high risk? How do we proceed? Just a moment for me to speak about the intelligence officers who do this type of work. When they look at these events that are happening all around the world, they really have to put on their KLM glasses. They have to look and go, how does this affect what we are doing with KLM? So they really have to frame those things and make sure that they understand what the relevance is to KLM. And I also have this mental model of these guys just kind of plugged into the internet, reading as much news as they can. And I have this feeling that that'd be really great in a pub quiz for current affairs type stuff. Not so sold on how good their knowledge on like popular music and things like that would be though. So how can we help these guys? There's a lot of mundane things that they do that we just want to see if we can automate away. We don't have any intention to try replace intelligence officer. There's way too much context that goes on in the world for us to even be considering that. It's really, there are a lot of reports that they need to do on a daily basis to just kind of make sure that our operations are safe. So really for us, if we can work out just 5-10% little increments to their process, that's great. The other thing is, as I said, it's very context driven, the work that they do. So how much of a framework can we provide them to just be that little bit more effective in their work? And we are slowly making some headway there. One of the analysts, intelligence analysts, had a complaint the other day, and they said the security officers are now getting through their work much more efficiently, which means I now have more work on my plate. So I'm quite happy with that type of complaint, to be honest. So the slides up to here were kind of just setting the context for why we are talking about Modulith. When I started working at KLM about 18 months ago, my boss said to me, hey, we have some projects that we would like you to look after. Most of them we think are going okay, but there is this one project which is a rewrite of a legacy project, and we're just getting signals that things are not going well there. So I spent about a month, 2 months working with the team, having a look, just kind of finding my feet a bit. Went back to my boss and I said to him, I have good news and I have bad news. The bad news, the good news is that you were right. Like, the bad news is you didn't know how right you were. I don't think this code base is something that we can actually save. I think we have to start from scratch. Long conversation with my boss, who fortunately is fairly technical, and came to the same conclusion. We can't do anything with this. We actually have to just rewrite this. That's an easier conversation than going to your business, who's now just paid for 2 years of development, and going to them and say, like, sorry guys, we now have to start from scratch again because none of these best practices were put in place. So they weren't particularly happy with that, but at the end of the day, they understood that, well, this is something that we need to do. So what did we do? We tell that big lie that all software developers do. We promise we'll be better than the guys that were before us. But we don't, we do this, and it's never from a malicious perspective. It's always from that insane confidence that software engineers have that we were better than the guy before us. Like, we can do it better. So how did we go about doing that? Well, I mean, you just write code that isn't bad, right? Or at least you do put all of the best practices in place to make writing bad code hard. So the de facto standard for us was Spring Boot. I really wanted to go Kotlin, but the rest of the development team was more familiar with Java, so that was kind of the route we went. Commitlint, because we wanted to do automated releases, and Google Java format, because we didn't want to argue about Sparg about formatting. Sonar Cloud and the quality gates that it provided were hugely beneficial for us, because one of the things that happened with the previous code base was that the team kind of got into this death spiral of pressure, and they could never really escape from it. So dev team, the business analysts, everybody just kind of got into this thing of being under pressure because the development cycle was so unpredictable. So we really needed to have a conversation with the entire team and go, how do we want to be perceived? And how do we want to be perceived externally, and how do we want to perceive ourselves? Because we can put all of the best tooling in place, but if we don't stop ourselves internally and go, that code that we're committing is just not up to standard, then, we're never, ever going to make any success. But these are all the standard things that that everybody should be doing. There's nothing unusual or nothing that really goes back to that big promise about governance that we made to business. Around about this time, Modulith went GA, and there was a statement in their release notes that said supports the verification of such modular arrangements. For me, this is a hugely important thing because as engineers, we all want to use architectures, be it the onion architecture, layered architecture, hexagonal architecture, whichever. We all want to use some kind of architecture. But when we actually try and apply that architecture, when that architecture meets the code, there's always that little nuance in our code base that we don't know how to do. So if we can get to a point where we actually go look at this and go, we are applying this architecture and now we are saying that you don't conform to that, your build is failing. That is a huge, huge key for what we were trying to get at. I'm just going to go through the standard example from the Modulith website just for people who may not be intimately familiar. So we have here two modules. We have the inventory module, the order module. The inventory module uses the really standard Java access modifiers. So inventory management is public. That internal class uses the default access modifier. That means it's not accessible outside of the inventory module. But this is pretty standard Java stuff at this point. The order package is kind of getting closer to what we think of as a more complex example. So at the root folder, we've got order management, which would be our API level. The interesting thing here is that it doesn't matter what this order internal class, what its access modifier is. It can be public, but because it is an internal or a sub-package, Modulith will just fail when you try access it. It just will say, no, that's not part of our standard definition. You're not allowed to do this, which is great because that's how we don't write bad code maliciously. Well, this is the wrong conference for that. But it's never an intentional thing. Somebody normally links to something unintentionally, and this stops that unintentional moment from happening. One of the things that came up when we first started using Modulith was people saying, but we've already solved this problem. You know, if I use Gradle or if I use Maven, I can take those modules and I can do a multi-module project, and then I can just, I can keep things segregated into my layers that way. And yes, you can do that, but it does feel like an abuse of your build system to try use it to apply architectural constraints. Other thing I would say is that that internal system that we talked about, or that internal package, that would not, you don't get that check by doing this. The Modulith project comes with some really standard defaults. The root layer of your module is the API or the exposed layer. Everything underneath it is internal and not exposed. That doesn't mean you can't imply something like the layered architecture to it, but it just means that you now need to add some extra annotations. So if you wanted to do that approach, you would have these named interface annotations, which would then be applied on the package info class, package info class, and those would allow you to do that type of stuff. Although I do feel that the moment you start going down that road, you take the road that we took, which was we kind of started bike shedding on architecture, because once you start looking at Modulith, you have this possibility of diving really deeply down this hole. So there's a great project called JMolecules, which you can actually start using to say, I want to do layered architecture, annotate your classes or your package info files, and you can really, really strictly say where classes should be, where what a module should be, and you can have great arguments, which is what we did for about 2 months, was trying to decide how this perfect architecture for our application should be. what I would say is until you actually understand what Modulith is trying to do, that you stick with the default. Because once you start going down this thing, you can just go into a rabbit hole, which is what we ended up doing. So this is an example from our code base. What this is really trying to do is it's feature flagging. So there is two fields in a database table, the key and the value. Value is Boolean. And all we're trying to see is the feature enabled or disabled. If you have a mental model of what that looks like, and you look at the architecture that we came up with here, I think you can agree that's an overkill. Because we came up with an architecture and we decided this should be applied to everything. But is that really necessary? If you're doing something like feature flagging, do we need something like this? I'd argue that you don't. We could have, even this for me is fairly conservative because we still have our DTOs, we still have our converters. That would be much better in my opinion, and that would have been much more pragmatic. We are still using Modulith here because we are still using Modulith. The other things are all internal. We're only exposing 2 classes. Why not? And just because we like to structure things into packages, majority of people would do something like this. I would as well probably, but why not? So again, this is one of those moments where we really dived in without understanding Modulith. And I think that conceptually the idea here is great because we had our providers and we really wanted to make sure even within that provider that the client and service modules would only interact with each other via the APIs. I think conceptually that's a good idea. The problem is that Modulith doesn't support nested modules. So then we kind of were going on our own way and running into our own little problems with Modulith because we were trying to make our own path. We probably should have just compromised and done something a little bit simpler, which wouldn't have been as kind of aesthetic as we wanted it to be, but would have still served the same purpose. Having said that, I now see in Spring Modulith 1.3, they do support nested modules, so we could kind of get closer to what we originally came up with. Taking a step back from Modulith for a moment, one of the things that I thought was really important in this journey, because adopting Modulith was just part of the equation. The other part was how do we make sure that the team is all on the same page? I didn't really speak about it much, but you saw the map that I showed earlier. Our team was distributed. We have developers in, I think it is 5 different countries, from a development team of about 5 or 6 people, so nobody was really in the same place. One of the things that really pushed us towards adopting ADRs was that we wanted to go towards continuous releases. And one of the things that you want to do when you're going towards continuous releases is have those semantic release notes. And we wanted to do that using commitment. One of the developers came up to me and he said, yeah, hey, here's this pull request. It means that we can use semantic releases and kind of move towards those automated releases that we wanted. I looked at it and I was like, yep, absolutely, let's do that. We committed we pushed those changes, merged them in, and then developers' builds started breaking. That was hand up, yep, we shouldn't have done that because, I mean, if you haven't used commitment before, it's not particularly nice. You're trying to push your change because we use pre-commit hooks as well, trying to push your change, and all of a sudden your commit breaks. What's commitment? I don't understand what's going on. So that was one of those moments for us where we looked at it and we were like, okay, that was a mistake. We really need to record what we are doing as a team and kind of make sure that everybody's on the same page before we proceed. As I said earlier, when you adopt Modulith, you kind of get introduced to some other libraries that I was not available. ArchUnit is something that stands alone, and Modulith actually uses it to enforce the majority of its rules. You don't need to use Modulith to use ArchUnit. I think it's a great library in its own right. But this is, for me, was one of those things that was really cool. Was as part of our architecture ADR, we said we didn't want to use named interfaces because we said it was a code smell. Using ArchUnit, we could then write a test that said, hey, as per our ADR, we don't allow the usage of named interfaces. Here's another example of something that we could do with ArchUnit. When we did this rewrite, there was still the front end of the application. The back end of the application was rewritten, but we had to keep API compatibility. So that means some of our code base needed to be migrated to the new code base to be API compatible. But we also wanted to limit the amount of impact that the old legacy classes had on our new code base. Yeah, that happened because that was hard. Conceptually, it was a great idea, but it was really hard to actually do this within a reasonable time constraint. I did recently discover that ArchUnit has something called a freezing arch rule. So what this does is the first time you run this test, it will write to a text file all of the violations that have happened in that test. You then commit that file as part of your, you then commit that file and it becomes part of your repository. It means that the next time that test runs, it looks at the record that it has and goes, okay, these are the current violations of that test. But if a new violation is added, then that test will fail. And then if you have less and less violations, obviously the violations text file will shrink and shrink. And that way you can at least make sure that you're not expanding those list of violations, and hopefully you can work towards getting them a bit smaller. So one of the unexpected things for me about using the Modulith project was Spring application events. So before using Modulith, we didn't really use application events, or I've never really used application events other than for things like on startup, on core Spring events, never really for inter-module communication. Once you really dive into Modulith, it doesn't force you to do this type of stuff, but it really just kind of puts you on a bit of a slope where at some point you just fall into using events and you're not entirely sure how you ended up there. The one thing that we missed out here when doing this was that we were so focused on the architectural stuff that Modulith could give to us that we missed out what that annotation wasn't there. That annotation isn't just a marker for the fact that you're using Modulith, it adds async and transactional there as well. So what this means is if you're using that annotation, that if your JVM dies and you are using the registry broker, that when your JVM starts up again, you can actually save those events. That was a miss from our perspective, and that's something we need to go add in because it's there, why not use it? This is another one of those ones for the blooper reel for us, was we have to download events from multiple source providers. And we have this mechanism where we trigger a download event, and then all of the different providers then go, okay, my specific implementation of downloading something, I will go do that. And this is a little bit of a copy from our old code base, but as we kind of copied it across, we were like, crap, we're using events now. Let's make this an event. Before that, every event provider just had the @scheduled annotation, off it went. When we tested this locally, everything worked fine. We pushed it into test, everything worked fine. When we deployed this to production, we had some duplicate events. I'm like, that's a bit odd. What's going on here? We just assumed it was something weird when we deployed. Maybe one of the old systems hadn't gone down properly. Maybe the data migration wasn't great. We weren't sure. So we just kind of brushed it off. Next day, came back into work. We had a couple more duplicates. So at this point, we were like, something's not right here. And started looking through the log files and saw this scheduled event, trigger download event message coming up milliseconds apart. That's a bit odd. Go look into the logs a little bit closer, could see that they were coming from the different hosts. So it's like, okay, so our schedule locking isn't working here. Like, what's the deal? And then you realize yourself 10 minutes ago was a dumbass. Because all this method is doing is triggering a download event. That lock is only ever going to be milliseconds long. So yes, we'd locked this method, but we were locking it for milliseconds. And if those two nodes were just milliseconds off, then they would start, then they would independently trigger their own event downloads for the different providers. Not sure if that constitutes a one-line fix or a one annotation value fix. The funny part about this was the workaround fix for production was we just decreased from 2 nodes until 1 node until we could deploy this. If it's stupid and it works, I don't know if it's stupid. So one of the questions here, implicit in the name, so is modular monoliths. It's the portmanteau of this. And the question is, if we look at our application, could we split it apart into microservices? I played around with this a little bit. I just, in a variety of different ways. So I just took one of our modules and deleted it, curious to see what happened. Firstly, the tests failed, which makes a bit of sense. But once I actually deleted the test as well, the rest of the application just continued working. So that is quite nice to see those safeguards there. But it also does give me the confidence to say that we could very easily take those event providers and split them out into different microservices if we wanted to. Because conceptually, all that those event providers are doing for us is that they are downloading events from external providers, and they are either going to be putting them into a queue or putting them into a database. There's a different part of that system that is presenting it to the users. So, yep, we could conceptually do that. But probably not going to do that because the juice isn't really worth the squeeze at the moment. The extra added infrastructure costs for doing that, we just don't see the benefit right now. But it is nice to know that we can. So, I mean, I won't really speak about that too much because I think that's fairly self-evident in the changes that the reduction in code base that we got, going down from 80 to 13 database tables, lines of code. I know also that the code coverage value is now higher. I think at this point it's a bit of a game for the developers to see if they can get up to 90%, whereas previously it was a real struggle for the guys to even stay at 56%. For me, the real takeaways here were that if you do start looking at Spring Modulith, stick with the defaults until you've kind of earned the right to play with, to stick with the defaults until you've understood the project enough to work out what you should be doing. Like, don't come in with preconceived ideas of, okay, cool, I'm going to use Modulith, and then I'm going to use ports and adapters architecture. Because probably you don't need to do that. Probably the default implementation is just good enough. Once you've worked with it for a little bit of time, look at it and go, actually, this isn't good enough. Maybe I need to do X, Y, Z. But give it the chance to kind of bed into how you work. The other thing that I thought was quite interesting was that I asked one of my developers just before the session, so we've been using Modulith for a bit of time now. What are your thoughts about it? Like, what are your reflections? And his response was, well, I'm not really using it much at the moment, so I can't give you too much insight. And I thought that was interesting because he'd still been committing and working on the code base that week. But what he was meaning is that he hadn't been writing any Modulith rules. It had become part of the workflow so much that we weren't violating rules anymore because you just kind of understood how you should be writing code. So we didn't run into Modulith. And we also weren't really writing any of the kind of Arch unit type rules either. So I thought that was really cool in that it just became part of the workflow. It didn't slow anybody down. It just worked. So this is our journey so far with Modulith. I think it's been a huge benefit for our development process. Obviously, I cannot speak to what this graph is going to or how this is going to look in the next couple of years. But I have confidence that it gives us the tools to continue in this direction. And closing remark would be, this has been our blooper reel, kind of like the mistakes we've made. And I'm really curious to see how other people can build upon this body of knowledge and kind of go out there and make their own mistakes and then share them back with the community so that we can just grow how we should be applying this out in the field.
That was wonderful. I really enjoyed that. It's amazing what kind of difference it made looking at this. What's the score? And I have to give you the prize today for the best subtitles. There's so much humor in them. Thank you so much, Tim.
Sure.
Any questions for Tim? Ask them now. Nothing here. Okay. Yeah. Oh, of course. Okay. Thank you.
About how long did it take for you to get the development team to buy into the Modulith concept?
I think that was one of the difficulties is that because I'm an engineering lead, I'm not always with the team. So it was something I really battled with. And I think it was part of why we started what I termed architecture shedding, was because they were still trying to find their feet. So in some ways, I think probably took like a good 3 or 4 months for people to really buy in. But at that point, we'd kind of spent a lot of time spinning our wheels with preconceived notions on, hey, you know, I've always done layered architecture. Now, how do I apply layered architecture? And so I would say a good 3 to 4 months, and then we kind of embedded these ways of working in. So I would say that was probably how long it took us. Good.
Is there a project where you would say don't start with Modulith?
No, I mean, I think initially when the Modulith project started, it was aimed at more greenfield type things, and we kind of shoehorned greenfields because we did a rewrite. But I know that Oliver's been doing a lot of work on making this that you can retrofit it to legacy code bases. And I think things like the freezing architecture test from the Arch unit guys means that you don't have to be perfect. You can go like, these are our violations right now. We just need to get better. So I think I'm sure there are some examples where you shouldn't, but for me, if you can, just go and try to see how you can make things better slowly along the way.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. So if there's no more questions, one last chance. All right, no more questions. So then we'll see you, and the folks on the live stream, we'll see you back at 20 minutes past the hour.